A scorched circle of blood and black ash stained the center of the basement floor. Right in the middle sat his father's empty boots, but his father was gone, as if something had ripped him straight through the solid concrete and dragged him down into the deepest, darkest pit of hell. As a man of science, Alan never believed in ghosts or demons, but that night, a single horrifying laugh from the other end of a dead phone line turned his entire world upside down. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Tonight, I'm bringing you a truly terrifying story that will chill you to your core. Make sure you stick around until the very end for this one. Let's dive right in. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3 a.m. Outside, the brutal Chicago winter was in full swing, muffled only by the soft, rhythmic scratching of snow against the window pane. Alan bolted upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 a.m., the witching hour, the time of night when demonologists believe the veil between our world and the abyss wears thin enough to tear. The apartment was dead silent. Then the landline in the living room rang. Ring, ring, ring. The sharp, piercing sound sliced through the dark. Who the hell would be calling on a landline at this hour? Throwing his blanket aside, Alan stepped onto the freezing hardwood floor and tiptoed into the living room. The glowing green caller ID screen offered no comfort. It just read, unknown. With a trembling hand, he lifted the receiver to his ear. Instantly, the static, heavy roar of a violent wind rushed through the line. It sounded like someone was standing at the edge of a jagged, bottomless canyon. "Hello?" Alan's voice cracked. At first, there was nothing but the howling gale. Then, from somewhere impossibly distant, a familiar voice emerged. It was weak, strained, and trembling with sheer agony. "Alan, Alan, help me. It's taking me." Alan's blood turned to ice. It was his father, Samuel. "Dad, what's wrong? Are you at the cabin in Montana?" Alan yelled into the receiver, panic clawing at his throat. "Alan, it's back," his father wheezed, his voice breaking. "It waited 3 years. It's got me locked in a black room. Absolute darkness. I can't breathe. Alan, it's looking for you next. Run, Alan. You have to run." His voice cut off. Over the line came a sudden violent screech, the unmistakable sound of heavy iron chains scraping across a concrete floor. And right after that came the laugh. It was a jagged, metallic chuckle that defied human anatomy. It was the exact same laugh Alan had heard 3 years ago in that Forsaken basement in Montana. Then a raspy, guttural voice whispered directly into his ear. "Your father belongs to the abyss now. You're next, Alan." Click. The line went dead. Alan stood frozen in the dark, the dial tone buzzing in his ear like a swarm of hornets. Cold sweat dripped down his neck. Without wasting another second, he grabbed his heavy coat, sprinted to his car, and hit the highway toward Montana. Alan never believed in the supernatural. He was a data analyst, a man of science and logic. But his father, Samuel, lived a double life in the remote woods of the Blackfoot Mountains. To the locals, he was just a quiet woodsman. In reality, he was a rogue exorcist. When priests failed, people came to Samuel in secret. Alan hated it, dismissing it all as delusional folklore. Until 3 years ago. That night, a guttural, inhuman roar had echoed from the cabin basement, drawing Alan downstairs. There, he saw a neighbor's body contorted backward at an impossible, sickening angle, his eyes completely black-pitched. As Samuel chanted in Latin, a massive, suffocating shadow tore its way out of the man's mouth. It wasn't a ghost, it was an Ifrit, an ancient, high-ranking demon of fire and shadow, a pure, primordial parasite. That night, the towering black entity had locked its burning red eyes onto Alan. It reached out with a frost-bitten, clawed hand and pressed it against Alan's forehead, instantly paralyzing his mind. The Ifrit's voice had echoed inside his skull. "I will tear your father apart, and I will drag your entire bloodline down to hell with him." Alan blacked out from pure terror. The next morning, his father revealed a grim truth. Years ago, Alan's mother had unknowingly desecrated an ancient burial ground in those mountains, tethering the Ifrit to their bloodline. Terrified, Alan packed his bags and fled to the bright lights of Chicago, thinking the crowded city would protect him. But the Ifrit had simply been playing the long game. The sun was barely rising when Alan's SUV skidded onto the snow-covered dirt road leading to the cabin. His heart dropped. 2 state trooper cruisers were parked out front, their blue and red lights bleeding into the morning fog. He threw the door open and rushed inside. The cabin was suffocatingly cold, thick with the rancid stench of rotting meat and sulfur. Alan grabbed the nearest deputy. "Where's my dad?" The deputy, pale and visibly shaken, looked away. "We cleared the whole property, Alan. Your dad is gone, but you need to see the basement." Alan's legs felt like lead as he descended the wooden stairs. When he reached the bottom, his breath hitched. In the exact center of the concrete floor, a massive circle had been aggressively scorched into the ground with ash and dried blood. Right in the middle of the circle lay his father's boots and his silver crucifix, but Samuel was gone. It looked as though something had dragged him straight down through the solid floor. "Officer," Alan stammered, his voice shaking violently. "My dad called me at 3 in the morning. He's alive. He's in danger." The sheriff turned to Alan, his expression dead serious. "That's impossible, son. The blizzard knocked out the grid yesterday afternoon. The phone lines for this entire county have been physically snapped in half by fallen trees. No calls have gone in or out of this cabin for the last 24 hours. It's a dead line." The world seemed to spin around him. If the lines were dead, who had called him his apartment in Chicago? Later that afternoon, Alan brought a veteran priest and a local Native American shaman to the basement. The shaman knelt, tracing the perimeter of the ash circle. When he stood up, his face was devoid of color. "Alan," the shaman whispered, his voice trembling, "the Ifrit didn't murder your father. It dragged his soul through a portal into a dark mirror realm, a pocket of purgatory. It's a black labyrinth. No human has ever crawled out of it." "Then how did he call me?" Alan choked out, tears burning his eyes. The shaman placed a heavy hand on Alan's shoulder. "Kid, your father didn't make that call. It was the Ifrit. It mimicked Samuel's voice to lure you back to this cabin before sunrise. It wants your blood. If you had been sleeping in your bed upstairs last night, you would have been dragged under too." The priest and the shaman performed a binding ritual, sealing the basement and temporarily cleansing the cabin of the demonic residue. But Samuel was gone forever. A year has passed since that horrific morning. Alan sold the cabin and cut all ties to Montana. Now he lives in his Chicago apartment with every single light left on, 24/7. Sleep is a luxury he can no longer afford. Every night, as the clock ticks closer to 3 a.m., a paralyzing dread creeps up his spine. He stares at his phone, sweating through his clothes in total terror, because he knows one of these nights the screen is going to light up with that dreaded word, unknown. And he knows that if he answers, he won't hear his father's cries for help anymore. He'll just hear that hollow, metallic laugh, letting him know that his time is finally up. The next story.
Deep within the fog-shrouded pine forests of Maine lay a broken military radio with no batteries and no power source. Yet in the dead of night, the desperate cries of a boy who went missing 50 years ago began leaking from its speakers. And Omar had no idea that this forbidden frequency was actually a trap designed to drag him straight to hell. The pine forests stretching across northern Maine have always been known for their primeval, fog-shrouded beauty, but deep within those woods lies a cursed patch of land where cell service completely vanishes, yet an old batteryless military radio will violently come to life on its own. Omar was an audio engineer living in Boston. He had a borderline obsession with collecting vintage audio equipment, old landlines, antique microphones, and transistor radios from a bygone era. A massive accent wall in his bedroom was covered entirely with radios from the 1950s through the 70s. Omar always believed that old objects carried a piece of history with them, but he never could have guessed just how terrifying that history could become until a brutal weekend in late September. It was a Saturday afternoon when Omar spotted it at a rural estate sale in a remote county in Maine. An elderly man was clearing out the rusted remnants of his family's old homestead. Tucked inside a corroded wooden crate at the very back of the barn, Omar found it. It was a World War II-era military transistor radio. It had a heavy olive-drab metal chassis, 2 oversized tuning knobs, and a long, jagged iron antenna. Strangely, the battery compartment on the back had been melted shut with thick industrial plastic. There was no way to insert a battery or hook it up to a power source. It was structurally dead. When Omar asked for the price, the old man's face drained of color the moment his eyes landed on the device. His hands began to shake. "If you take that thing off my land, I'll pay you," the old man whispered, his voice cracking. "Just remember one thing. If you ever hear static coming out of it in the dead of night, do not touch the tuning dial. Leave it exactly as it is and run out of the house." Omar figured the old man was just losing his mind in his old age. How could a radio with no batteries or power source ever play? Suppressing a smirk, he stuffed the heavy green radio into his backpack and drove back to his Boston apartment. That night, the bedroom clock read 2:40 a.m. The entire apartment complex was dead silent. A cold, miserable rain was falling outside, clicking softly against the window pane. Suddenly, Omar bolted awake. He hadn't had a nightmare, but an unnatural weight suddenly pressed down on his chest. The air inside the bedroom had abruptly plummeted to freezing temperatures, and his breath hung in the dark like thick white smoke. Then a sound cut through the silence from his desk.
Shh. It was the unmistakable white noise of a radio searching for a signal, the sharp, abrasive hiss of dead static. Omar sat frozen in bed, He stared at the military radio across the room, and a cold spike of adrenaline shot down his spine. The tiny analog display screen, where the frequency numbers were printed, was glowing with a faint blood-red light. Trembling, he stepped onto the icy hardwood floor and approached the desk. He checked the dials. The main power switch was clicked firmly to off. The battery compartment was still sealed shut with melted plastic. There was no current, no battery, no logic, yet the radio was alive, churning out a low, aggressive hum. As Omar reached out a hand to lift the vibrating metal chassis, a human voice suddenly cut through the white noise. It was a boy's voice. He sounded no older than 8 or 9, whispering and sobbing through a curtain of static. "Is anyone there? Hello? I can't find my way out of the woods. It's so dark out here. It's coming toward me. Please help me. My name is Danny." Danny. The name struck Omar like a physical blow. Being an audio engineer from New England, he had read countless archives on local missing persons cases. In 1971, a 9-year-old boy named Danny vanished into the Blackwood Forest of Maine during a camping trip. 500 police officers and bloodhounds had scoured the woods, but they never found so much as a scrap of his clothing. Now, 50 years later, that same boy's voice was coming through a dead radio. Suddenly, a violent cracking sound erupted from the speaker, like heavy frozen branches being snapped in half by something massive. Danny's voice escalated into a blood-curdling shriek. "It's here! It's climbing down from the trees! No! No!" For one horrifying second, a sound like heavy, leathery wings flapping tore through the audio, followed by a sickening crunch. Then absolute silence. The red light on the display screen snapped off. The room plunged back into pitch blackness. By the next morning, Omar knew he would never sleep again if he didn't uncover the truth. He tried desperately to convince himself that it was a sick prank, that someone was broadcasting onto an old frequency using a powerful wireless walkie-talkie. He threw the radio into his bag, hopped into his SUV, and sped towards the Blackwood Forest in Maine, the exact wilderness where Danny had disappeared half a century ago. By the time he reached the edge of the tree line around noon, the atmosphere was suffocatingly heavy. A dense, unnatural fog hung over the pines, turning the daylight into a sickly pale gray. Omar stepped out of his car and began walking down the overgrown, deserted trail. The radio inside his pack remained completely silent. He hiked nearly 2 miles into the dense heart of the ancient pine woods, where the canopy of ancient pines grew so thick that the sun couldn't penetrate the darkness. Suddenly, his iPhone vibrated violently in his pocket and went black. He turned it on only to see no service, a completely dead signal.
But right at that exact moment, the backpack against his spine began to vibrate. Grrr, grrr. Omar ripped the backpack open and pulled the radio out. This time, the display screen wasn't just humming, it was pulsing with a blinding crimson glare. Breaking the terrifying silence of the woods, Danny's voice came through the speaker again, but it wasn't crying anymore. The voice was dead, flat and hollow. "Omar, you came. I'm sitting up in the trees. Look up, Omar." Omar's entire body went numb with dread. How did this thing know his name? He had never spoken a word to it. His neck felt stiff as he forced his head upward, staring into the foggy crowns of the towering pine trees. High up on a massive dead branch, he saw it. It wasn't a little boy. It was a pitch-black, towering silhouette, easily 7 feet tall. It didn't have human arms, instead huge avian wings with rotting leathery membranes hung from its shoulders.
And its face, oh God, its face. It had no eyes, no nose, no skin, just a gaping, bottomless black void for a mouth, from which the exact grinding static of the radio was blasting into the open air. Native American legends in the Northeast speak of a primordial demon, the Windwalker, a malicious entity of the air that perfectly mimics the voices of the lost to lure its prey deeper into the abyss. 50 years ago, Danny hadn't just got lost, he had been taken by this thing, and today it had used Danny's voice to reel Omar in. In a split second, the 7-foot shadow threw its wings back and lunged downward, diving straight towards him. Omar didn't look back. He slammed the radio into the dirt, spun on his heel, and sprinted for his life. His boots tore through dry leaves and snapped twigs, but right behind him, the deafening sound of heavy leathery wings and the roaring static of the radio pursued him like a freight train. He could feel it. The entity was right on his neck. The air grew so unnaturally cold that his skin began to turn blue, blistering from instant frostbite. Panicking, Omar tripped over an exposed root and slammed violently into the ground, tearing open his knees and elbows. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the end, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. Suddenly, right next to his ear, a harsh metallic voice, sounding exactly like a blown-out radio speaker, whispered, "You can't outrun a dead line, Omar. Once the frequency matches, it plays forever." Right as the shadow closed in, a chaotic racket erupted from the dense brush. A massive flock of wild crows swarmed out of the trees, diving aggressively on the demon in a black cloud of feathers and talons. Seizing the momentary distraction, Omar scrambled to his feet and ran like a madman. When he finally reached his SUV, he was bleeding, his clothes were shredded, and his chest was heaving. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed on the gas, and didn't stop driving until he hit the Boston highway. Looking in his rearview mirror as he peeled away, he saw the towering black silhouette standing at the edge of the fog, slowly waving its elongated arm. It has been 3 months since Omar escaped that forest. He made it back to his Boston apartment, but he is far from free. He has torn down every vintage radio from his walls, smashed them to pieces, and thrown them into a dumpster. He doesn't keep a single audio device in his home. But pure terror doesn't need a device. It infects the mind. Now, every single night, at exactly 2:40 a.m., the temperature in his bedroom drops below freezing. His laptop screen glitches, his cell phone screen turns blood red, and a loud drilling static echoes directly inside his own skull. Grrr, grrr. And then, from the other side of his closed 4-story window, a sharp, elongated claw begins to scratch against the glass. Screech, screech.
And inside Omar's head, Danny's innocent, terrifying voice whispers one final time. "Omar, you left the radio in the woods, but our frequency is already locked in. Open the window, Omar. It's so cold out here. It's time to go up into the trees." Omar sits curled up in the corner of his bed, pressing his hands over his ears, praying for the morning sun. But deep down he knows that one of these nights his hands will no longer belong to him. He will stand up, completely hypnotized, and slide the window open.